Hey class, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the humanities and thinking about the disciplines of the humanities and the ways in which those disciplines kind of approach knowledge. So, over the last few weeks, we looked at like COVID-19 from a natural science perspective, right? And what we're going to actually do this week is look at disease from the perspective of the arts and the humanities. So I want you to just get a sense of how different disciplines can approach the same material and just how like drastically different it can be, right? So the humanities are going to be concerned with like human thought and ideas, creative expression. They're often going to focus on writing, like on novels or on poems or on visual art forms such as film or painting or sculpture, and these are going to approach the same subject matter in a radically different way from say biology, which studies a virus at a genetic level. So here's a list of a lot of different majors that fall under the umbrella of humanities. This English class is a humanities class. History courses, philosophy are often thought of as humanities. There's but even things like as different as like game design are fall under the humanities. Anytime you're studying like the classics or language, that's a humanities. And yeah. So also like if you did like a creative writing degree, that would be a humanities major also. History, we're not going to do history like directly, but I am going to have you read something that kind of looks at like the history of writing about plagues and stuff. But history is going to be concerned with events that impact a group of people, okay? And they're going to try and answer the questions of like how or why things happen and what the consequences were. So, if you look at historians through time, they may have different approaches to like how they do history, but they're always trying to like answer these particular questions. Okay. In arts and literature, which is a little bit more of what we're going to focus on, it's a little bit more about interpretation from our perspective, and what we're looking at is like what is the writer or artist saying about like what makes life worthwhile, or what is the meaning of human existence, or like what is beautiful, what is interesting. So those are kind of the questions that practitioners in the arts and literature are going to try to address. And like the for us the sort of joy of, I guess, studying art and literature. Of course, I'm an English teacher, so I'm a little biased, right? But you get to learn, you get to become somebody else, or experience something from another perspective, right? So you can feel those experiences without going through them yourself. You can take on. Vicariously live through a narrator in a story, and kind of put yourself into that story, whether it be a film or a novel or a short story or a poem. And the same deal with art. You can kind of experience what's expressed in the art in a way that just kind of expands our empathy and our ability to know what other people experience. So when you're reading in the humanities, right? One thing I will say is like it's good to focus. Here I list 4 things. I say focus on values, pay attention to the medium, look for a message or an interpretation, and read slowly. So when we say focus on values, a lot of times an analysis or interpretation will say like, this is what the story is trying to get us to like appreciate or to be like, or something like that, right? So it's a way of kind of saying like, what's the message, right? It's another way of saying that, I guess. And when I say pay attention to the medium, what I mean is like when you do analysis, right? You want to look at the form, right? So what I mean by that is, say you're looking at a painting, right? Well, you may analyze the colors that are chosen or the technique of the brushstroke. If you're looking at a film, you might analyze the camera angles to help you to explain like how the artist achieves the effect they're trying to achieve. Similarly, if you're reading a story, you're going to pay very close attention to the language and the words they choose, right? And all of that helps you to like build your interpretation. So we're going to talk about that really, and we're going to over the next couple of weeks we're going to look at a lot of different art forms and just kind of think about each medium and how it works and how the artist uses it to convey whatever it is that they're trying to convey. So, writers are going to give you hints or clues. Like a short story or a movie is not always going to be direct. It's not always going to be didactic and tell you like, hey, this is the message, right? A lot of times you have to read between the lines, or you're going to feel what the artist wants you to feel, right? And so that's kind of reading between the lines is the act of interpretation. Like that's how you're going to, that's where the writing happens and the analysis happens in the humanities. So, a proficient reader develops an interpretation of what's happening in a story, and you want to be careful that that interpretation is logical and realistic. And what that means is like that it's supported by that that you can support it with details about what's happening in the story. Okay, and I'm going to show you kind of how to do that in the next couple of slides. So when you're interpreting prose, like so that would be like a short story or a novel or an essay, you can use the literary elements to support your interpretation. Okay, these are what are commonly thought of as the literary elements, which is setting, characterization, plot, point of view, conflict and climax, and theme and style. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what each of these are, and then what each of and then kind of give you like some examples. So let me go back to let me show you a little bit more about these. So setting, right, is the where it takes place, basically, right? Where is the story taking place? And so you can ask yourself these kinds of questions, right? Like, how is the setting created? What's the geography, or are there weather details? Is it a certain time of day, right? What role does the setting play in the story, right? Is it important to the plot or the theme, or is it just a backdrop? So setting is always kind of important. It can always tell you things about the story and the character. And the story that you're going to read this week from Edgar Allan Poe is going to take place in a certain time period, in a certain kind of building, and you can interpret that and talk about how it impacts or influences the story. Okay. You can also study the time period, like when was the story written. This is an older story that we're going to read this week. It's from the 1840s. Okay, so it's nearly 200 years old, and you're going to notice one question here is, how does the time period affect the language, atmosphere, or social circumstances of the story? We may not know a lot about the 1840s. You may want to like do a little research to find out what was going on in the world at that time or what it was like. But first off, the language you're going to probably find is a little, I guess, archaic might be the word. It's not going to sound like modern English. But you also can just look at the social circumstances of the story and think about how they reflect or do not reflect society at the time. The other thing you can analyze is the characters. Who's the main character? Are they described through dialogue, or what do we learn about them by the way they speak? Do we know anything about their physical appearance, about their thoughts and feelings? Do we see them interact with other characters? Another interesting thing is like, do the characters learn anything over the course of the story? Or are they static, flat characters who do not change, or are they dynamic, round characters who do change? A lot of times in short stories, there's like an epiphany or a like single event where like a character may learn something, or they may have an opportunity to learn something, and they may or may not learn it. And all of these are things that we can look at when we're trying to understand the characters and how the characters convey something to us as readers. Another thing we can look at is the plot. So, what is the action basically in the story? What things happen? Okay, so what's the structure? Is it linear, like and chronological, or does it jump around? And is it believable or not? This story is a bit that you're going to read this week is a little bit of a supernatural kind of gothic story. It may not seem, in some ways, it may not feel believable, right? But Poe wants you to believe to a certain extent that the actions could take place, I suppose, you know. Point of view has to do with, is it a first person narration, second person, or third person? First person is I, where you have a narrator saying like, I went to the store and I did this or whatever. Third person would be a narrator who's not in the story saying like, you know, Jamie went to the store and he, you know, bought some coffee. So second person is you, where it says like you go to the store. And point of view, you know, first person tends to be closer. You feel a little more in the story, and but that narrator can also be unreliable sometimes. We sometimes may realize that they don't understand something that they're supposed to understand. Third person is usually a little bit more objective or detached, and so you know sometimes the way that the story is told can impact how you interpret the story. Conflict often can lead you to like an interpretation, like what is the conflict in the story and how is that conflict resolved. The resolution is the climax. You know, is there a turning point in the story? Where does it take place? And conflict can be external, like with another character. It can be internal with yourself. It could also be external, like with the environment or with the world. So there are a number of ways that conflict can happen in a story. And really, theme is really important, right? It's the main idea, lesson, or message in the short story. And it can be an abstract idea about the human condition, society, or life. So just ask yourself, what's the story about? What's the message here, right? Are there elements that are repeated that suggest the theme? Is there more than one theme? Sometimes there can be like symbols you can like read into things in the story. Like there may be an image that appears a lot of times that like lead you to a certain interpretation of a story. And then another element that's important to look at, and especially in writing, is like the vocabulary, right? And this is where I was just talking about imagery or tone or the feeling of the story, right? So figurative language, right, is language that is suggestive, right? Where the author may say like, it was like, and then they explain what it was like, and through that figurative language they're trying to convey a particular mood, right? You can look at the images, look at the symbolism, and sometimes you'll see more of this than in some stories than you will in other stories. It really depends on the author, okay? But these are a lot of things that you can use to do your analysis, okay? And I want to just come back here for a second, and I want to show you like a few examples of how this like sort of plays out, right? So I would use this analysis to support my interpretation, right? And so after I've read the story and I've done some annotating as I read and stuff, I might say like, you know, Edgar Allan Poe uses literary element number 1 and 2, let's say, you know, characterization and plot, right, to convey whatever it is that I think that I want to argue he's trying to convey, okay, in the story. Whoops. Back to my last slide. Okay. Right. And so, you know, the other thing you could do is, right, this second version looks very similar to the first one, but basically like, right, he uses a couple of elements, and it doesn't have to be 2 elements. It might be 3 elements. It might be 1 element to convey the theme of whatever, you know, the message in Masque of the Red Death. And here it is just a little bit more specific, right? Edgar Allan Poe uses his use of language to describe the castle and his characterization of Prospero make the reader feel whatever it is I think that he's trying to make the reader feel when they read The Masque of the Red Death. Okay, so this would be like a sort of specific almost thesis statement that I could then support with details about how he used the language to describe the castle and analysis of how he used characterization of Prospero, who's the main character in the story, to make me feel some specific thing. And I didn't want to put in what I think. I don't want to like lead you to a certain interpretation of the story. I want you to come up with your own interpretations, okay? But this is just an overview of how to approach it, okay? So there's more stuff in the modules to kind of help you out with that, and hopefully we'll have some fun with the story and with thinking about literary analysis this week, and we'll do some more with some other art forms next week.